Okay, I hope I'm audible to all my students who are attending this particular lecture for the CBSE Class 12 Economics course. In this particular lecture, we are going to start with the first topic within the Indian economy course. This is Indian economy on the eve of independence. So in this particular module, we are going to learn how the Indian economy, be it the agricultural sector or the industrial sector or the service sector, how the Indian economy has been performing in these three sectors in the pre-independence period and in the post-independence period. And we are going to compare. We are going to do a comparison of the performance of the sectors in the Indian economy in the pre-independence before 1947 and in the post-independence post 1947 period. So let's quickly start with this particular lecture. All students who are attending this particular lecture can see this particular lecture note on their screens, where we start with the agricultural sector on the eve of independence. So we are going to see how the agricultural sector in the Indian economy has been performing in the pre-independence and in the post-independence period. So students can open up your handouts to this particular topic, and let's quickly go through this. So within the agricultural sector on the eve of independence, let's look at the first point, which talks about low level of productivity. Okay, so if we talk about the two major crops which are grown in our economy, which are wheat and rice, it has been observed that there has been a low level of productivity, which in turn led to a lower level of output despite having a larger area under cultivation. So this means that despite the area under cultivation being sufficiently large, there has been low productivity in production of major crops like wheat and rice, which in turn has led to a lower level of output. So lower productivity has been the reason for lower level of output despite having larger area under cultivation. Now students can look at this particular table, okay, where you see that there are two crops, wheat and rice. Okay, one variable we are looking at is productivity. Productivity is captured in kilograms per hectare, and then we also look at production, how much production is happening in lakh tons. So there are two periods we are comparing. 1947 period is being compared with 2013 to 14 period. And if we do a comparison, students can clearly see, if I look at the productivity parameter first, students can clearly see that in 1947, the productivity of wheat was 660 kilograms per hectare. That means in 1 hectare of land, 660 kilograms of wheat was getting produced. Okay. So this has increased to 3059 kilograms per hectare in 2013 to 14. So there has been an increase. So I can say that the productivity was much lower on the eve of independence. The productivity of wheat was much lower in the pre-independence or the eve of independence period compared to the post-independence period. Similarly, check for rice. In 2013 to 14, the productivity for rice was 2419 kilograms per hectare. But on the eve of independence, it was only 665 kilograms per hectare. So for both wheat and rice, we learned that the productivity captured by kilograms per hectare was lower in 1947 compared to 2013 to 14. Okay, and similarly, students can check out the production parameter also. You can clearly see that in 2013 to 14, the production of wheat was 959 lakh tons, whereas on the eve of independence, the production of wheat was only 64 lakh tons. If you check out the same figure for rice, in 2013-14, the production of rice was 1065 lakh tons, but it was only 220 lakh tons on the eve of independence. Okay, so the data we have taken, so students can also see the source of the data. This is production and productivity of wheat and rice, a comparison between the levels in 1947, which is the independence year, and 2013 to 14. The data is taken from the Economic Survey 2014 to 15. And now I am explaining this is the explanation which students can see for the table. Okay, the table shows that the productivity of both wheat and rice was 4.6 and 3.6 times respectively lower in 1947 compared to the levels in 2013-14. That means, if mathematically, students can also check this out using your calculators. The productivity of wheat was 4.6 times lower. That means 3059 divided by 4.6 will approximately give you 660. So you can check this out. You can check this out that 3059 divided by 4.6 will approximately somewhat give you 660 as your answer. Similarly, the productivity of rice was 3.6 times lower in 1947 compared to 2013-14. So 2419, which is my figure for 2013 to 14 productivity of rice, 2419 divided by 3.6 is going to approximately give me 665. Again, students can check this out using your calculators. Likewise, if I talk about the level of output is captured by production. Okay, the level of output of wheat and rice was nearly 15 and 5 times respectively lower in 1947 compared to the levels in 2013-14. That means if I talk about wheat, 959 divided by 15 will approximately give me 64, which is the production of wheat in lakh tons in 1947, and 1065 divided by 5 will approximately give me 220. Not exactly, approximately it's going to give me 220, which simply indicates that the production of rice in 1947 was 5 times lower than what it was in 2013-14. So students are requested to learn up the first point completely. You should learn up these values. You should learn up the table up also. All students who are attending this particular lecture will be having this particular handout either in the hard copy form or in the soft copy form. So students are requested to get the hard copy form of this handout and start learning these points. Okay, so let's look at the second important point, which talks about the agricultural sector on the eve of independence. High degree of uncertainty. So in India, the agricultural sector showed a very high degree of uncertainty because it was mainly dependent on rainfall. We all know that whatever crops are produced in the agricultural sector, specifically wheat and rice, which are the major crops, they depend on rainfall. If the rainfall is good, the harvest is going to be good. However, a bad rainfall or a drought situation would lead to lower production of these crops. So you can clearly see that good rainfall implied good output, while poor rainfall implied poor output. No effort was made under the British rule to develop permanent means of irrigation, including wells and canals. So the Britishers never spent a penny on getting permanent means of irrigation so that the rainfall water could be stored. So as a result, only those years where the rainfall was good, the agricultural output was higher, whereas years with drought situations had lower levels of agricultural output. So that means that without permanent means of irrigation, agriculture sector in the Indian economy showed a very high degree of uncertainty. In some years, the agricultural output was very high. In some years, the agricultural output was very low. And the major factor determining this was the rainfall. Okay, let's look at the third point, a gap between the owners and the tillers of soil. The owners of soil were the owners of land. The tillers of soil were the farmers who were working on that land, farmers or peasants. So I am again looking at the third point, a gap between the owners and tillers of soil. The owners of soil were the owners of land. The tillers of soil were the farmers who were putting their blood and sweat on producing crops on the soil. Okay, so the owners were seldom the actual tillers of the soil. The owners shared the output but not shared the cost of output. The cost of output was only borne by the tillers of the soil, because they were actually the people who were working hard on the field, making crops, producing crops. The owners were just getting the share of the output without shedding a sweat on the soil. That means the owners were not doing any hard work on the soil. The tillers were the ones who were actually working hard on the soil, producing crops. The owners simply used to take a share of that production. So the tillers of the soil were given barely enough for subsistence. So the farmers who were actually working hard on that soil, producing crops, were hardly given any output. The major share of the output was taken away by the owners of the soil, leaving barely anything left for the tillers who were actually putting their blood and sweat on the soil. Okay, so backwardness and stagnation of agriculture was the obvious consequence. Okay, the agricultural sector could not develop. On the eve of independence, there was backwardness and stagnation in agricultural production because tillers were exploited by the owners of the soil. Okay, let's look at the fourth point, which is the last point, uneconomic and fragmented land holdings. Okay, so on the eve of independence, Indian farmlands were fragmented and scattered in pieces. So the farmlands were divided. Fragmented means they were divided and scattered into pieces. Accordingly, most land holdings were uneconomic, yielding low surplus. So the agricultural land was further divided. It was further divided or fragmented, and most of the land holdings were uneconomic. Uneconomic means they were not yielding sufficient profits. Okay, so these are the 4 points which talk about the performance of agricultural sector on the eve of independence of the Indian economy. If I quickly sum up, there was low level of productivity captured by lower productivity and production of major crops in the Indian economy like wheat and rice. Second point, there was high degree of uncertainty because the agricultural sector majorly dependent on rainfall. Good rainfall means good output, bad rainfall means bad output. No incentives taken by Britishers to develop permanent means of irrigation. Third point, gap between owners and tillers of soil. Owners continuously exploited the tillers who were actually the farmers working hard on the soil. These owners used to take a major share of the output produced by the tillers. As a result, tillers couldn't even get that much output which was enough for their subsistence. As a result, this led to backwardness and stagnation of Indian agriculture. The fourth point, the land holdings in the agricultural system in India were fragmented. They were divided into pieces. As a result, every particular land holding was not giving enough surplus or enough profits. So the land holdings in the farmlands were not well organized. Okay, so hoping students have understood this. Now let's look at the next topic, which is factors causing backwardness and stagnation of Indian agriculture during the British rule. Mark this as a very important topic from examination point of view. What are the factors which were responsible for backwardness and stagnation of Indian agriculture during the British rule? So let's look at these factors. We can identify some main factors that contributed to backwardness and stagnation of the Indian agriculture during the British rule. The first one was the land revenue system. Okay, we all have learned about the land revenue system in history before. Okay, so in the land revenue system, we had the zamindars and we had the peasants. The peasants were the actual tillers of the soil. They were actually the people who were working hard on the soil, and the zamindars were the permanent owners of that land or that soil. Okay, so according to this system, the zamindars were recognized as the permanent owners of the soil. This is soil. So students can see this properly. Please write in your notes soil. The zamindars were recognized as the permanent owners of the soil. They were to pay a fixed sum to the government as land revenue. The government at that time were the Britishers. So the zamindars who were owning the land had to pay land revenue to the Britishers, and the zamindars were absolutely free to extract as much from the tillers of the soil as they could. The direct implication of the system of land revenue was that zamindars resorted to unlimited exploitation of the tillers of the soil. The zamindars frequently raised the land revenue and ejected the existing tillers in case they objected to raise. Okay, so if I come to the whiteboard to explain, just as a diagram. So if we talk about the zamindari system, also called the land revenue system, there were three parties involved in this. One was the British government. At that time, the rule was of the British government in the Indian economy. Then we had the zamindars. Zamindars were the permanent owners of the soil. And then we had the peasants, who were the tillers of the soil. People who were actually working hard on the soil. So the zamindars, the peasants used to pay the land revenue to the zamindars. And the zamindars used to pay a fixed rent to the British government. I can say fixed rent or a fixed sum of money to the British government. So the zamindars resorted to unlimited exploitation of the peasants. The zamindars used to increase the land revenue, and those peasants who objected to this were removed from the soil. So I can write this important point that the zamindars resorted to unlimited exploitation. They resorted to the unlimited exploitation of the peasants or the tillers of the soil. Okay, so hoping all students have understood this particular diagram. Okay, you don't need to draw this diagram in your exams when you are presenting this answer, but this diagram was just to help you visualize that how in the land revenue system, also called the zamindari system, the zamindars resorted to unlimited exploitation of the tillers, as they were also required to pay a fixed sum of money to the government as land revenue. Okay, so hoping all students have understood point number 1. Now point number 2, which was a major reason for exploitation of the Indian agriculture, or I can say backwardness and stagnation in Indian agriculture, forced commercialization of agriculture. Now let's first of all understand what is meant by commercialization of agriculture. So I can write that commercialization of agriculture refers to a shift from the cultivation of self-consumption to cultivation for the market. So when I talk about commercialization of agriculture, I am no longer producing crops for my own consumption, but I am producing crops to be sold in the market solely for the purpose of making profits. Now, the Indian farmers were forced to shift to commercial crops. The commercial crops which were giving revenues to the British government were indigo. Okay, indigo was heavily used in the British textile industry. Indigo is a crop which is used for textiles. Okay, and the Britishers forced the farmers to produce more of indigo, as this would help the British textile industry. So the farmers were forced to produce commercial crops like indigo from the conventional subsistence crops like rice and wheat. So instead of producing rice and wheat, which were meant for consumption, farmers were now producing commercial crops like indigo. And they were forced to do this by the government, by the British government. Reason, I've given the reason also. Indigo was required by the textile industry in Britain for dyeing or bleaching of the textile. So earlier the farmers, so they here means the farmers. Earlier the farmers would grow grain for their family consumption, but now they had to buy this from the market. So earlier, when the Indian farmers were producing wheat and rice, they would keep some part of this production for their own family. But now, since majorly they were into producing commercial crops like indigo, they no longer had some portions of wheat and rice kept with themselves. They now had to buy this from the market. But they would seldom have cash owing to the mounting indebtedness. The farmers in India were very poor, particularly at that time on the eve of independence. They didn't have the required money to buy wheat and rice, these important crops from the market. Consequence, stick to agriculture and always be at the mercy of the landlords or the moneylenders. The farmers had to either borrow money from the moneylenders. The moneylenders used to charge a very high rate of interest on the loans given to the farmers. As a result, the farmers were in a debt trap. They had too many loans on them from the moneylenders. They had to stick to agriculture and always be at the mercy of the landlords. Because if they don't obey the landlords, they were removed from the soil and they didn't have any money to buy the crops, the subsistence crops like wheat and rice. So if I sum up the whole point, the second point talks about commercialization of agriculture, which states that the British government had forced the farmers to move towards production of commercial crops like indigo, which was benefiting the Britishers, particularly the textile industry, in Britain. Okay, so the farmers, instead of producing crops like wheat and rice for their consumption, were producing commercial crops like indigo. As a result, the farmers had to buy wheat and rice from the market. They didn't have that much money to buy these crops, so they had to either obey to the landlords, be at their mercy, or go to the moneylenders. The moneylenders charged very high interest rates on the loans given to the farmers, which resulted in farmers being in a debt trap. Okay, so hoping students have understood point number 2. Point number 3, low level of productivity. Okay, so low level of productivity. What was the reason for low level of productivity? We have just learned a few minutes back that there was low level of productivity captured by lower productivity per hectare, lower production per hectare for both wheat and rice. If I scroll up, we had seen that on the eve of independence for both wheat and rice, the productivity captured by kilograms per hectare was lower in 1947 compared to 2013-14. Now we are looking at the reasons for this low productivity. So if I scroll down, low levels of technology, lack of irrigation facilities, particularly lack of permanent means of irrigation, and negligible use of fertilizers resulted in the low level of productivity. So there are three major reasons for the low level of productivity in Indian agriculture. Reason number A, low levels of technology. Reason number B, lack of irrigation facilities. Reason number C, negligible use of fertilizers. The cultivator had neither the means nor any incentive to invest in agriculture. So agriculture in the Indian economy even today is not thought of as a business, but only as a means of subsistence. Because there was no incentive in the form of better technology or better fertilizers or better irrigation facilities. There was no incentive in agriculture. So no one would want to actually get into the agricultural sector. The British rule spent little on agricultural technique or mass education. So the Britishers again never spent much on getting better technology in the agricultural sector or educating the farmers on use of fertilizers and pesticides in crop production. Okay, as a result, this made it difficult to introduce modern technology, which caused a perpetual low level of productivity. If the Britishers had spent good amount of money on introducing modern technology and use of fertilizers and pesticides on the eve of independence, Indian agriculture would have had a higher level of productivity. But since the British rule did not spend much on improving the technology or educating the farmers per se, as a result, Indian economy ended up with a lower level of productivity in the agricultural sector, as we can see from the table which we have just done a few minutes back. Okay, point number 4, adverse effects of partition. Now, Indian agricultural production received a further setback due to the country's partition at the time of independence. Okay, a sizable portion of the undivided country's highly irrigated and fertile land went to Pakistan. So when partition happened between India and Pakistan, okay, major portion of India's fertile land during the partition went to Pakistan. That was called the Sindh land. It was highly irrigated, highly fertile land, and during the partition, it went to Pakistan. Almost the whole of jute producing area became the part of East Pakistan, which is now called Bangladesh. So remember, the partition led to West and East Pakistan. The West Pakistan, India's fertile land, okay, went to West Pakistan, and India's major jute producing land went to East Pakistan. So India's jute goods industry, which had enjoyed a world monopoly so far, India was one of the major producers of jute and one of the major exporters of jute. But because of this partition, since major jute producing area went to Bangladesh or East Pakistan, India lost its competitiveness in the world market for jute and no longer enjoyed the monopoly it used to have in the export of jute. So as a result, Indian jute goods industry, which had enjoyed a world monopoly so far, suffered heavily for the lack of raw material. So if I sum up the 4th point, it talks about adverse effects of partition as another reason for backwardness in Indian agriculture. When partition happened, most of the India's fertile land went to West Pakistan and most of the India's jute producing land went to East Pakistan. As a result, India couldn't enjoy the world monopoly in jute production and exports. And since most of the fertile land went to Pakistan at the time of partition, the production of wheat and rice also drastically fell at that time. Okay, so these are the 4 points which give us the reasons for backwardness and stagnation of Indian agriculture. The land revenue system, okay, the forced commercialization of agriculture, lower levels of productivity in Indian agriculture, and the adverse effects of partition. So hoping all students have understood this. Then let's talk about the industrial sector on the eve of independence. How the industrial sector was performing on the eve of independence. Okay, so Remember, industrial sector uses the raw materials from the agricultural sector to make finished goods. Okay, so India could not develop a sound industrial base under the British rule, even systematic deindustrialization, which led to systematic deindustrialization. So I can say that India could not develop a sound industrial base under the British rule, which led to students can write this in your handouts, which led to systematic deindustrialization. The motive behind systematic deindustrialization was to get raw materials from India. So deindustrialization means that the role of industrial sector in India was de-emphasized. Okay, and Britishers had introduced this deindustrialization so that they could buy the raw materials from India, they could make finished goods and sell these finished goods back in the Indian market. So the Britishers were very smart. They introduced deindustrialization. That means industries in India were almost shut. Britishers were buying raw materials from India, making finished goods and selling them back to India. That means under the British rule, the Indian industries were seldom allowed to produce the final good. Deindustrialization simply means that the industries in India were almost shut. So Britishers were buying raw materials, making finished goods and selling them back to India and earning money from their exports to India. So the poor state of industrial sector during the British rule is illustrated in the following point. So let's look at the reasons for the poor performance of the industrial sector in India on the eve of independence. Point number one, discriminatory tariff policy of the state. The state here means the Britishers. Okay, now all students should know that a tariff is a tax imposed on the goods imported from abroad. Okay, so a discriminatory tariff policy was pursued. Why discriminatory? It allowed tariff-free industrial products into India. That means whatever India was importing from Britain, there was no tariff on that. That means the Britain goods were cheaper for India. Very simple, guys. When you import something from abroad, if there's a tariff imposed on that, it becomes more expensive. Now, Britishers were very smart. When Indians imported Britain goods, there was no tariff imposed on those British goods. As a result, those British goods were cheaper. But India, which was exporting handicrafts to Britain, placed a heavy duty on the export of Indian handicraft products. That means what India was exporting to Britain, there was a heavy duty imposed on that, which made Indian goods expensive in Britain markets. So Britain goods were becoming cheaper in Indian markets, but Indian goods were becoming expensive in Britain markets. As a result, India's exports was falling, but India's dependence on Britishers was rising. India's imports were rising. As a result, while the British products became cheaper in the Indian markets, the Indian handicraft products became costly and started losing their domestic as well as the foreign market. So decay of handicrafts was the end result. And let me tell all students, India was very good in production and export of handicrafts. But the moment the British rule started, Britishers started imposing raw materials, and they imposed this discriminatory tariff on exports from India. That means Britishers using this discriminatory tariff policy made Indian products more expensive. And the Britishers removed the import duty on their goods, which made Britain goods cheaper. So even the Indians were buying Britain goods at that time. There was a loss in competitiveness for Indian handicrafts in the market. Okay, so if I come to the whiteboard, I can sum up on the whiteboard that I can write that the British goods became cheaper. The British goods became cheaper in the Indian market as the import tariffs on British goods were removed. What are import tariffs? Tax on imported goods. I am writing in the bracket. Import tariffs are the tax on imported goods. So the British goods became cheaper in the Indian market as the import tariff was removed. Whereas the Indian handicrafts became expensive in the Britain because of export duty imposed. Export duty is a tax on exported goods. What India was exporting in the form of handicrafts, a tax was imposed on that when they entered the Britain territory. So as a result, the Indian handicrafts became more expensive in the Britain market because of export duty, which caused a fall in the Indian exports of handicrafts, which caused the fall in the Indian exports of handicrafts. Both these points are telling us that the British goods were becoming cheaper in the Indian market. They were becoming cheaper in the Indian market because of removal of import tariffs, but the Indian handicrafts were becoming expensive in the Britain market because of export tax or export duty. Okay, as a result, the Britishers were earning high on foreign exchange. India's foreign exchange was dropping because what India was earning from export handicrafts, that earnings of India were falling because of this export duty imposed by the Britishers. So if I come back to the notes, students can clearly see the first point being explained. Okay, now let's look at the second point, competition from machine-made products. Now, Indian handicrafts required more of labor, whereas the goods produced in Britain required more of machinery. Okay, so the machine-made products were more low-cost products. So the machine-made products from Britain were low-cost products and gave a stiff competition to handicraft products in India. Remember, the goods produced using labor are more expensive because you have to pay the wages to that labor. On the other hand, machine-made products in Britain were less costly. Okay, so competition forced the Indian handicrafts to shut down their enterprises forever because the Indian craftsmen were producing good quality handicrafts, but they were expensive. On the other hand, the Britishers were using machine-made products which were much cheaper. The machine-made products are always cheaper compared to handmade products because handmade products require more time and energy. The cost is high, whereas machine-made products require lesser time and lesser energy. So as a result, the machine-made products were cheaper as compared to the handmade products. Now, Indian handicrafts, which were majorly labor-intensive, requiring more of labor, were facing a good amount of competition from the low-cost, cheap machine-made products by Britishers. As a result, the craftsmen in India were forced to shut down their business. The third point, new patterns of demand. Owing to the impact of British culture, a new class emerged in India which was keen to adopt a Western lifestyle. When Britishers started ruling India, even the people in India started getting accustomed to the British lifestyle. They started preferring Britain products over Indian products. So this changed the pattern of demand against the Indian products and in the favor of British products. So as a result, what happened? The demand for Britain products went up, the demand for Indian products went down. In the process, the Indian industry tended to perish. Because most of the people were more in the favor of buying Britain products. As a result, the British industries were flourishing, whereas the Indian industries were getting shut down because even Indians hardly were in the favor of buying Indian products. Mostly, they were willing to adopt the Western lifestyle. Fourth point, very important point for backwardness in the Indian industrial sector, introduction of railways in India. We all know that the railways in India was introduced by the Britishers. Now, the objective for introducing railways was again in the self-interest of the British government. So, guided by self-interest, the British government introduced railways in India. This was to facilitate transportation of British products across different parts of the country. The reason for introducing railways in India was so that Britishers can transport their cheaper products across different parts of the country. Consequently, the size of the market for low-cost British products tended to expand, while it started shrinking the high-cost Indian products. The Indian products were of high cost because they required more of labor, more of handwork. The British products were cheaper because they required more of machinery. Machine-made products were cheaper. So the Britishers were very clever. They introduced railways so that they could transport their cheaper products across India, so that the demand for Indian products fall and Indian industries shut down. This hastened the process of decay of Indian handicrafts. Okay, so fourth point, very important point. Railways was introduced in India so that Britishers could transfer their cheaper products across country. Okay. Fifth point, lack of capital goods industries. Now, in macroeconomics, we have learned what are capital goods. Capital goods are those goods which are used to produce final goods and services. And capital goods majorly include machines, tools, factories, plants, etc. So capital goods industry refers to those industries which can produce machine tools, which are in turn used for producing articles for current consumption, like the iron and steel industry, like the fertilizer industry. So all these are capital goods industries. Majorly, the iron and steel industry is a very good example of a capital good industry because iron and steel are used to produce a lot of finished goods. During the British rule, there was hardly any capital goods industry to promote further industrialization in India. The Britishers did not spend any penny on building the capital goods industry in India. As a result, India was heavily dependent on Britishers for final finished goods because Indian industries were getting shut down during the British. Okay. Sixth point, limited role of the public sector. So the public sector in India was also facing a drawback. The limited area of operation of the public sector in India was also a significant reason for drawback of the industrial sector. Even the public sector or the government officials were the puppets of the Britishers at that time. They were not adopting to policies to benefit India, but they were adopting to policies to benefit the Britishers. They were the puppets of the Britishers. So the public sector remained confined only to railways, power generation, communications, ports, and some other departmental undertakings. The public sector also did not spend money on building the capital goods industry in India. Okay, so these are the 6 points which talk about backwardness or the performance of industrial sector on the eve of independence. Okay, these are the 6 reasons which tell us why the industrial sector at the time of independence could not develop in India, because there was a discriminatory tariff policy followed by the British government. There were competition faced from machine-made products produced by Britishers. New patterns of demand caused even the Indians to adopt to the Western lifestyle, increasing the demand for British products and reducing the demand for Indian products. Introduction of railways allowed cheaper British products to move across all parts of the country, shutting down the Indian industries. The Britishers did not spend any money on building the capital goods industry. The public sector in India was only limited to some areas like railways, power generation, communication. The higher officials in the public sector were the puppets of the Britishers. They didn't take policies which could benefit the Indian economy in terms of the industrial sector. So I stop in this particular lecture. What we have majorly covered in this lecture are performance of the agricultural sector at the eve of independence, reasons for backwardness of Indian agriculture on the eve of independence, and performance and backwardness for the industrial sector in India on the eve of independence. Now, in the next lecture, I am going to look at the demographic condition in India on the eve of independence. So I'm going to start this particular topic in the next lecture. So I stop in this lecture. I hope students have enjoyed this lecture. Any doubts? You can unmute your mic and ask, or you can get in touch with me for doubts on call or WhatsApp, or you can mail me your doubts at divineschoolof economics@gmail.com. This is where I stop in this lecture.